Welcome. I am Daisy, your hostess, and you are in my book playlist. In this video, I am going to explore through the writings of Frank Harris. He was an infamous character of his time in the late 19th century. He made his name as a journalist and author, becoming a key figure of the literary and political scene. He was known to be friend of Bernard Shaw, Oscar Wilde, Winston Churchill, and Aleister Crowley, to name a few. In particular, in this video, I will be narrating one of the 9 stories from the book titled Unpath'd Waters. The story is titled The Magic Glasses, and it was first published in Aleister Crowley's The Equinox, Volume 1, Number 1. To me, this story has a very deep meaning, even though it almost had this flair of the Emperor's New Clothes, but yet it was more twisted and kind of sad, the idea that if you had a chance to know the truth, would you choose not to? So with that, let's go ahead and turn the page. The Magic Glasses. One raw November morning, I left my rooms near the British Museum and turned down Regent Street. It was cold and misty, the air like shredded cotton wool. Before I reached the quadrant, the mist thickened to fog, with the color of muddied water, and walking became difficult. As I had no particular object in view, I got into talk with a policeman and, by his advice, went into the Vine Street Police Court to pass an hour or two before lunch. Inside the court, the atmosphere was comparatively clear, and I took my seat on one of the oak benches with a feeling of a vague curiosity. There was a case going on as I entered. An old man, who pretended to be an optician, had been taken up by the police for obstructing the traffic by selling glasses. His green tray with leathern shoulder straps was on the solicitor's table. The charge of obstruction could not be sustained. The old man had moved on as soon as the police told him to, and the inspector had substituted a charge of fraud on the complaint of a workman and a shopkeeper. A constable had just finished his evidence when I came into the court. He left the box with a self-satisfied air, and he muttered a remark that the culprit was a rare bad un. I glanced about for the supposed criminal and found that he was seated near me on a crossbench in the charge of a sturdy policeman. He did not look like a criminal. He was tall, thin, and badly dressed in a suit of rusty black, which seemed to float about his meager person. His complexion was tallowy white, like the sprouts of potatoes which had been kept a long time in a dark cellar. He seemed about 60 years old, but he had none of the furtive glances of the criminal, none of the uneasiness. His eyes rested on mine and passed aside with calm indifference, contemplative and not alarmed. The workman, who was produced by the police in support of the charge of fraud, amused me. He was a young man, about middle height, and dressed in corduroys, with a rough jacket of dark tweed. He was a bad witness. He hesitated, stopped and corrected himself, as if he didn't know the meaning of any words except the commonest phrases of everyday use. But he was evidently honest. His brown eyes looked out on the world fairly enough. His faltering came from the fact that he was only half articulate. Disentangled from the mist of inappropriate words, his meaning was sufficiently clear. He had been asked by the accused, whom he persisted in calling the old gentleman, to buy a pair of spectacles. They would show him things truer like than he could see 'em. And so he went a bob on 'em. Questioned by the magistrate as to whether he could see things more plainly through the glasses, he shook his head. No, about the same. Then came the question. Had he been deceived? Apparently he didn't know the meaning of the word deceived. Cheated, the magistrate substituted. No, he hadn't been cheated. Well, disappointed then? No, he couldn't say that. Would he spend another shilling on a similar pair of glasses? No, he would not. 1 bob was enough to lose. When told he might go, he shuffled out of the witness box and on his way to the door attempted more than once to nod to the accused. Evidently there was no malice in him. The second police witness had fluency and self-possession enough for a lawyer. A middle-aged man, tall, florid, and inclined to be stout. He was overdressed like a spruce shopman, in black frock coat, gray trousers, and light-colored tie. He talked volubly, with a hot indignation which seemed to match his full red cheeks. If the workman was an undecided and weak witness, Mr. Hollett, of High Holborn, was a most convinced and determined witness. He had been induced to buy the glasses, he declared, by the old party, who told him that they would show him things exactly as they were, the truth of everything. You'd only have to look through him at a man to see whether he was trying to do you or not. That was why he bought them. He was not asked a shilling for them, but a sovereign, and he gave it 20 shillings. When he put the glasses on, he could see nothing with them. Nothing at all. It was a plant. And so he wanted the old party to take him back and return his sovereign. That might have caused the obstruction that the policeman had objected to. The old man refused to give him his money back, said he had not cheated him, had the impudence to pretend that he, Hollett, had no eyes for truth, and therefore could see nothing with the glasses. A blamed lie, he called it, and a due, and the old man ought to get 6 months for it. Once or twice, the magistrate had to direct the stream of emphatic words, but the accusation was formal and precise. The question now was, how would the magistrate deal with the case? At first sight, Mr. Brown, the magistrate, made a good impression on me. He was getting on in life. The dark hair was growing thin on top and a little gray at the sides. The head was well shaped, the forehead notably broad, the chin and jaw firm. The only unpleasant feature in the face was the hard line of mouth with thin, unsympathetic lips. Mr. Brown was reputed to be a great scholar, and was just the type of man who would have made a pedant, a man of good intellect and thin blood, who would find books and words more interesting than men and deeds. At first, Mr. Brown had seemed to be on the side of the accused. He tried to soften Mr. Hollett's anger. 1 or 2 of his questions, indeed, were pointed and sensible. "You wouldn't take goods back after you had sold them, would you, Mr. Hollett?" he asked. "Of course I would," replied Mr. Hollett stoutly. "I'd take any of my stock back at a 20% reduction. My goods are honest goods, prices marked plain on 'em, but 'e would not give me 15 shillings back out of my sovereign. Not 'e meant sticking to it all." The magistrate looked into the body of the court and, addressing the accused, said, "Will you reserve your defense, Mr. Henry?" "Penry, your worship, Matthew Penry," corrected the old man in a quiet, low-pitched voice, as he rose to his feet. "If I may say so, the charge of fraud is absurd. Mr. Hollett seems to be angry because I sold 1 pair of glasses for a shilling and another pair to him for a sovereign. But they were not the same glasses, and if they had been, I am surely allowed to ask for my wares what I please." "That is true," interrupted the magistrate, "but he says that you told him he would see the truth through them. I suppose you meant that he would see more truly through them than with his own eyes." "Yes," replied Mr. Penry with a certain hesitation. "But he did not see more truly through them," continued the magistrate, "or he would not have wanted you to take them back." "No, Mr. Penry acknowledged. "But that is this fault, not the fault of the glasses. They would show the truth if he had any faculty for seeing it. Glasses are no good to the blind." "Come, come," said the magistrate. "Now you're beginning to confuse me. You don't really pretend that your glasses will show the truth of things, the reality. You mean that they will improve one's sight, don't you?" "Yes," replied Mr. Penry. "One's sight for truth, for reality." "Well," retorted the magistrate, smiling, "that seems rather metaphysical than practical, doesn't it? If your spectacles enabled one to discern the truth, I'd buy a pair myself. They might be useful in this court sometimes." And he looked about him with a smile, as if expecting applause. With eager haste, the old man took him at his word, threw open his case, selected a pair of glasses, and passed them to the clerk, who handed them up to Mr. Brown. The magistrate put the glasses on, looked round the court for a minute or two, and then broke out. Dear me, how extraordinary! These glasses alter everyone in the court. It's really astonishing. They don't improve the looks of people. On the contrary, a more villainous set of countenance it would be difficult to imagine. If these glasses are to be trusted, men are more like wild animals than human beings. And the worst of all are the solicitors. Really terrible set of faces. But this may be the truth of things. These spectacles do show one more than one's ordinary eye can perceive. Dear me, it is most astonishing, but I feel inclined to accept Mr. Penry's statement about them. And he peered over the spectacles at the court. Would you like to look in a glass, your worship? Asked one of the solicitors, dryly rising, however, to his feet with an attitude of respect at the same time. Perhaps that would be the best test. Mr. Brown appeared to be a little surprised, but replied, If I had a glass, I would willingly. Before the words were out of his mouth, his clerk had tripped round the bench, gone into the magistrate's private room, and returned with a small looking-glass, which he handed up to his worship. As Mr. Brown looked in the glass, the smile of expectancy left his face. In a moment or two, he put down the glass gravely, took off the spectacles, and handed them back to the clerk, who returned them to Mr. Penry. After a pause, he said shortly, It is well, perhaps, to leave all these matters of fact to a jury. I will accept a small bail, Mr. Penry, he went on, but I think you must be bound over to answer this charge at the sessions. I caught the words, £50 apiece in 2 sureties, and his own recognizance in £100. And then Mr. Penry was told by the policeman to go and wait in the body of the court till the required sureties were forthcoming. By chance, the old man came and sat beside me, and I was able to examine him closely. His mustache and beard must have been auburn at one time, but now the reddish tinge seemed only to discolor the gray. The beard was thin and long and unkempt, and added to the forlorn untidiness of his appearance. He carried his head bent forward, as if the neck were too weak to support it. He seemed feeble and old and neglected. He caught me looking at him, and I noticed that his eyes were a clear blue, as if he were younger than I had thought. His gentle, scholarly manner and refined voice had won my sympathy, and when our eyes met, I introduced myself and told him I should be glad to be one of his sureties, if that would save him time or trouble. He thanked me with a sort of detached courtesy. He would gladly accept my offer. You stated your case, I remarked, so that you confused the magistrate. You almost said that your glasses were magic glasses. I went on smiling and hesitating because I did not wish to offend him, and yet hardly knew how to convey the impression his words had left upon me. Magic glasses, he repeated gravely, as if weighing the words. Yes, you might call them magic glasses. To say that I was astonished only gives a faint idea of my surprise and wonder. Surely you don't mean that they show things as they are, I asked. The truth of things? That is what I mean, he replied quietly. Then they are not ordinary glasses? I remarked inanely. No, he repeated gravely, not ordinary glasses. He had a curious trick, I noticed, of peering at one very intently with narrowed eyes and then blinking rapidly several times in succession as if the strain were too great to be borne. He had made me extremely curious, and yet I did not like to ask outright to be allowed to try a pair of his glasses, so I went on with my questions. But if they showed truth, how was it that Mr. Haller could see nothing through them? Simply because he has no sense of reality. He has killed the innate faculty for truth. It was probably at no time very great, went on this strange merchant, smiling. But his trader's habits have utterly destroyed it. He has so steeped himself in lies that he is now blind to the truth, incapable of perceiving it. The workman, you remember, could see fairly well through his spectacles. Yes, I replied, laughing, and the magistrate evidently saw a good deal more through his than he cared to acknowledge. The old man laughed too, in an ingenious, youthful way that I found charming. At last I got to the Rubicon. Would you let me buy a pair of your glasses? I asked. I shall be delighted to give you a pair if you will accept them, he replied, with eager courtesy. My surety ought certainly to have a pair, and then he peered at me in his curious, intent way. A moment later, he turned round and, opening his tray, picked out a pair of spectacles and handed them to me. I put them on with trembling eagerness and stared about me. The magistrate had told the truth. They altered everything. The people were the same and yet not the same. This face was coarsened past all description, that face sharpened and made hideous with greed, and the other brutalized with lust. One recognized, so to speak, the dominant passion in each person. Something moved me to turn my glasses on the merchant. If I was astounded before, I was now lost in wonder. The glasses transfigured him. The gray beard was tinged with gold, the blue eyes luminous with intelligence, all the features ennobled, the countenance irradiated sincerity and kindliness. I pulled off the glasses hastily, and the vision passed away. Mr. Penry was looking at me with a curious little pleased smile of anticipation. Involuntarily, I put out my hand to him with a sort of reverence. Wonderful! I exclaimed. Your face is wonderful, and all the others grotesque and hideous. What does it mean? Tell me, won't you? You must come with me to my room, he said, where we can talk freely, and I think you will not regret having helped me. I should like to explain everything to you. There are so few men, he added, who proffer help to another man in difficulty. I should like to show you that I am grateful. There is no cause for gratitude, I said hastily. I have done nothing. His voice now seemed to me to be curiously refined and impressive, and recalled to me the vision of his face made beautiful by the strange glasses. I have been particular to put down how Mr. Penry first appeared to me, because after I had once seen him through his spectacles, I never saw him again as I had seen him at first. Remembering my earliest impressions of him, I used to wonder how I could have been so mistaken. His face had refinement and gentleness in every line, a certain courage, too, that was wholly spiritual. Already I was keenly interested in Mr. Penry, eager to know more about him to help him, if that were possible, in any and every way. Some time elapsed before the formalities for his bail were arranged, and then I persuaded him to come out with me to lunch. He got up quietly, put the leather straps over his shoulders, tucked the big case under his arm, and walked into the street with perfect self-possession. And I was not now in any way ashamed of his appearance, as I should have been an hour or two before. I was too excited even to feel pride. I was simply glad and curious. And this favorable impression grew with everything Mr. Penry said and did, till at last nothing but service would content me. So, after lunch, I put him into a cab and drove him off to my own solicitor. I found Mr. Morris, of Messrs. Morris, Coote and Company, quite willing to take up his case at the sessions. Willing, too, to believe that the charge was trumped up by the police and without serious foundation. But when I drew Mr. Morris aside and tried to persuade him that his new client was a man of extraordinary powers, he smiled incredulously. "You are enthusiastic, Mr. Winter," he said half reproachfully, "but we solicitors are compelled to see things in the cold light of reason. Why should you undertake to defend this Mr. Penry? Of course, if you have made up your mind," he went on, passing over my interruption, "I shall do my best for him. But if I were you, I'd keep my eyes open and do nothing rashly." In order to impress him, I put on a similar cold tone and declared that Mr. Penry was a friend of mine and that he must leave no stone unturned to vindicate his honesty. And with this, I went back to Mr. Penry and we left the office together. Mr. Penry's lodging disappointed me. My expectations, I'm afraid, were now tuned far above the ordinary. It was in Chelsea, high up in a rickety old house overlooking a dingy road and barges drawn up on the slimy, fetid mudbanks. And yet, even here, romance was present for the romantic. The fog wreaths curling over the river clothed the houses opposite in soft mystery, as if they had been draped in blue samite, and through the water-laden air the sun glowed round and red as a fiery wheel of Phaeton's chariot. The room was very bare. The broad low window stood a large deal table crowded with instruments and glasses. Strong electric lamps on the right and left testified to the prolonged labors of the optician. The roof of the garret ran up towards the center, and by the wall there was a low truckle bed, fenced off by a cheap Japanese paper screen. The whole of the wall between the bed and the window was furnished with pine shelves, filled with books. Everything was neat, but the room seemed friendless and cold in the thick, damp air. There we sat and talked together till the sun slid out of sight and the fog thickened and the night came on. There our acquaintance, so strangely begun, grew to friendship. Before we went to dinner, the old man had shown me the portraits of his 2 daughters and a little miniature of his wife, who had died 15 years before. It was the first of many talks in that room, the first of many confidences. Bit by bit, I heard the whole of Mr. Penry's history. It was told to me piecemeal and inconsequently, as a friend talks to a friend in growing intimacy. And if I now let Mr. Penry tell his tale in regular sequence and at one stretch, it is mainly in order to spare the reader the tedium of interrupted narration and needless repetitions. End of part 1. You can find the links to part 2 and 3 in the description. If you could be so kind, give me some feedback. Let me know you were here. Hit that like button. If you like what you see and what you hear on my channel, please do subscribe. And I'll meet you at the next video for part 2.